If 2 years ago somebody had approached me and told that I would be sitting in front of a camera giving advice about IPMAT or CUET, I would instantly call them insane and walk away. If you don't know who I am already, my name is Arav Kasturi. I passed 12th grade this year with a score of 94.6% in my board exams, scored 922 in my CUET, and successfully converted IIM Indore with an All India rank of 55. And today I'm going to show you exactly how I managed IPMAT, boards, and CUET all together while simultaneously keeping all the other aspects of my life intact at the same time. So, how did I actually study for IPMAT specifically with all the other things going on? Coming to verbal ability first. So essentially for verbal ability, your reading speed and your reading practice needs to be at a high level. And to do this, you can use the daily reading comprehensions available on afterboards. And this really helped me. In addition to these daily RCs, you can also use this book, Word Power Made Easy, which really made my life a lot easier when it came to vocabulary. I remember there were like about 5, 6 questions in the actual IPMAT exam that I was able to answer because of the words that I had gone through in this book. So, coming on to reading skills, parajumble and paracompletion. So, essentially, about parajumbles, you need to trace the flow of ideas given in the paragraph. And honestly, this was the hardest part for me personally, as I would always get my parajumbles wrong. So, the only answer to this is practice, and of course you know identifying patterns such as connector words, conjunctions, etc., that you can immediately see and spot. So once you start identifying these frameworks on how to solve parajumbles and paracompletions through practice, life really gets easy. So for verbal ability, I would definitely recommend around 15 to 20 minutes of daily practice per day, in addition to 10 minutes of word power made easy, and you're actually good to go. So now coming on to quantitative aptitude. So the way to get better at QA is essentially in the form of a cycle, and this cycle begins with mocks. So when you do take a mock for any exam, you get a ton of exposure to the variety of questions, which is very similar to what actually comes. So an actionable step for any student writing IPMAT would be to take at least one mock every week on the weekend, preferably when you're free. Now, moving on to analysis, which is the second step of this cycle to improve your quants. Now, under analysis, we do something called the ABC analysis method. And A stands for Abhi Karo, B stands for Baad Mein Karo, and C stands for Chhod Do. Essentially, you need to categorize questions that you see in quants into these three buckets: A, B, and C. A being the easiest, C being the hardest. While doing ABC analysis, what you're trying to gauge is if whether you pick the right questions to answer in the actual mock exam. So, for example, if I am not good at binomial theorem, but I try to attempt a question from binomial theorem, that essentially means I try to attempt a C type question for me, and this wastes a lot of time in the actual exam. So you do this ABC analysis method to improve your question picking skills, which is ultimately what gets you into IIM Indore and not actually your mathematical knowledge. Now, under analysis, you also want to do approach based analysis. You basically want to see if there was an easier method to solve a certain type of question. For example, you see a question that can be solved in 2 steps by using a formula, whereas you instead took 5 minutes to solve the question in an entirely different way. When you do this approach based analysis, you essentially find the discrepancies in your thinking versus the fastest or easiest way to solve that actual answer. And you put these discrepancies or these learnings into something called a logbook. For example, in IPMAT quants under sequences and series, there is this concept called telescopic series. Now, the actual method to solve telescopic series is using partial fractions that you probably learned in integration. Now, unless you know this approach beforehand, you really wouldn't be able to solve this in the exam. And this is what I mean by approach based analysis. So, you essentially find a framework to solve a certain type of questions or certain types of questions that regularly appear in the exam, and you maintain and you record these in your logbook. And this really helps when you're trying to revise. Moving on to the last part of this cycle that you need to work on is the actual specific topics that you are weak on. And what you do here is you go back to the topics you were weak at and again study them and work on them. And there are various videos available on YouTube that you can find for these specific topics, for example, time and work or numbers. So this section is for all of you folks who have SRCC as your phone wallpaper, just like this guy. I started my CUET preparation in the month of January, and I would do around 10 questions of each chapter in MCQ format after I actually studied the same chapter for my board exams. This really helped me get question familiarity with respect to CUET. But the real challenge came when I had to prepare for CUET along with IPMAT right after my board exams, after I was completely gassed out. So, what I did was, I essentially, during the first week after my board exams, all I did was focus on microeconomics, which is a deleted part of your 12th syllabus but is there in CUET, along with just revision of IPMAT. And along with IPMAT mocks and classes in the evening, in the morning, I would try and make it a priority to take at least two CUET mocks. And now, although it's extremely difficult to manage both these exams simultaneously, since CUET comes after IPMAT, it can take a little bit of a backseat during your IPMAT prep phase. And if you dedicate just 1 to 2 hours of your morning time for just CUET prep when it comes to mocks or revision, you will be sorted. Now, there are a lot of differences when it comes to CUET and board exams. In board exams, it's more practical oriented, but in CUET, there's a lot of theory. For example, in accounts, there are a bunch of sections that you need to know by heart to answer questions in CUET, but those are not tested in your board exams. So, if I had to summarize for CUET, it would be mocks and NCRT reading thoroughly. And a third thing would be to maintain a special book to make mind maps, to note down specific laws in accounts, to note down important dates, etc. Because these are tested a lot in CUET and are usually omitted during board exams. Lastly, the most important thing I have to tell you is to not get demotivated by low scores in mocks. I remember sitting on the other side of the screen just like you and preparing for my IPMAT exam and seeing low scores like 130, 140 in spite of putting in so much effort to study. And I know exactly what you're going through right now. But the most important thing is to trust your process, trust the learning curve, and trust that you will get there after you put in a certain amount of effort. I was only able to get to the low 200s in my mocks after taking over 25 mocks. So that was it from my side. If you guys really enjoyed this video, please share this to all your friends who are preparing for IPMAT or CUET in 2027. If you guys have any additional questions or queries of any sort, let me know. I'll drop my Instagram down below. Reach out to me anytime and I'm always happy to help.